You don't realize the shift at first. It doesn't come with a moment of clarity or a dramatic decision. It happens quietly, when you stop explaining yourself to people who were never really trying to understand you in the first place. And in that silence, something changes. Not in them, but in you. You stop chasing understanding and start choosing peace. You stop overgiving your emotional world to people who only engage with fragments of it. And suddenly, what once felt urgent starts to feel unnecessary. Because the real turning point was never about getting someone to see your worth. It was about finally deciding you don't need to argue for it anymore. If you want an avoidant person to start feeling your absence, the first real shift is this. Stop explaining yourself. Most people do the opposite. They chase clarity. They overtalk. They try to fix misunderstandings by adding more words, more reasons, more emotional detail. They believe that if they just explain everything properly, the other person will finally understand and change. But that's not how this dynamic works. Avoidant patterns don't really respond to explanation. They respond to contrast. And when you stop explaining, you create that contrast. Suddenly, there is no more emotional noise from your side, no more justifying, no more filling in the gaps. What's left is silence. And that silence doesn't stay empty for long. It creates tension, not outside, but inside them. Because now they are no longer reacting to what you are saying. They are reacting to what you are not saying, to the missing explanation, to the unfinished emotional thread, to the lack of closure they didn't expect. Avoidant types tend to feel most comfortable when they sense control and emotional predictability. But silence without explanation removes that predictability. It becomes a gap their mind tries to solve. And the human brain naturally hates unresolved gaps. It wants answers. It wants structure. So it starts creating its own story. And when you remove your explanations, you also remove their ability to emotionally track you in real time. That's when thinking replaces interaction. They begin asking themselves questions like why you went quiet, whether they said too much, whether they pushed you away, or what you are thinking now. What used to feel like emotional stability from your responses turns into uncertainty. And that uncertainty is what starts to build internal attention toward you again. There is also something important here about emotional presence. When someone is always available, always explaining, always reaching out, the other person doesn't experience absence. And without absence, there is no internal pull. But when you step back and stop overgiving explanations, you create space. And space forces awareness. At that point, you are no longer the person constantly filling in emotional blanks for them. You become something they cannot fully read in real time. And the mind naturally gets drawn to what it cannot fully predict. There is a psychological pattern where inconsistent emotional access creates stronger mental focus than constant availability. Not because people want confusion, but because the brain pays more attention to what it cannot fully resolve. So when you stop over-explaining, you are not chasing them anymore. You are breaking the pattern where your emotional energy is always instantly accessible. And that shift changes how they experience you internally. Your silence starts to carry meaning. Your distance starts to feel noticeable. Not because you are doing anything dramatic, but because you are no longer filling every gap. And in that gap, their attention turns inward. They start to reflect, replay, and question. Not because you forced it, but because the usual emotional flow has changed. What many people miss is that this is not about punishment or control. It's about stopping self-abandonment. Because constantly over-explaining yourself to someone who isn't emotionally meeting you halfway slowly drains your own stability. It turns your voice into something that only exists to manage their reactions. When you stop, something shifts. You are no longer performing emotional maintenance for the relationship. You are simply present, without overgiving access, without over-justifying your feelings. That kind of calm distance changes the emotional weight in the connection. You stop chasing understanding and start holding your ground. And that alone changes how you are perceived. Because now you are not fully predictable, not fully available, not fully explained. And the mind of the other person starts trying to fill in what is missing. That is where curiosity begins to replace indifference, where silence starts to feel louder than words, and where your absence starts to register as something they can't ignore. When you step out of their emotional orbit without drama, without pleading, and without trying to force a reaction, something subtle but powerful happens. You put them in a quiet internal conflict they didn't expect. Why does your absence feel louder than your presence ever did? Why does the energy they once criticized suddenly feel missed? Why does silence start to carry more weight than all the conversations before it? Because when you leave without noise, you change the emotional structure of the connection. Not through words, not through confrontation, but through removal of access. You're no longer constantly available, no longer constantly explaining, no longer constantly reacting. And that shift forces a different kind of awareness in them. Not immediate understanding, but delayed reflection. This isn't about punishment or trying to provoke a reaction. It's about no longer giving away your emotional presence so freely. It's about taking back access to yourself. And when that access is no longer automatic, it changes how you exist in their mind. You are no longer something they can predict or lean on emotionally whenever it suits them. You become something they have to sit with mentally, without resolution. That's where the inner questions begin to surface. Why does this feel different now? Why am I thinking about them more when they're not actively present? Why does the space feel heavier than expected? But here's where most people misunderstand this dynamic. They think disappearing is only about distance. Physical distance alone means very little if emotionally you're still entangled. If you're still reacting internally, still overthinking, still trying to signal something through indirect behavior, then you haven't really stepped out of the pattern. True separation is not loud. It doesn't announce itself, it's calm, it's steady, it's internally settled. You're not waiting to be noticed, you're simply no longer participating in the same emotional loop. That's when the shift becomes real. This isn't about becoming cold or shutting down emotionally. It's about becoming clear. Clear about your boundaries, clear about your energy, clear about what you will and will not keep explaining. Because when you stop over-explaining yourself to someone who isn't emotionally meeting you halfway, you stop turning your voice into something that exists only to manage their comfort. Avoidant patterns, in particular, are sensitive to emotional intensity. Not because there's no feeling, but because closeness often gets associated with pressure in their internal wiring. So when someone responds with overwhelm, pursuit, or constant emotional processing, it can trigger withdrawal. But when your response becomes steady, grounded, and non-reactive, the dynamic changes. You are no longer pushing, you are no longer pulling, you are no longer emotionally flooding the space. You become harder to read, not because you are playing a role, but because you are no longer overexposing every emotional movement. And that creates something important: mental space. When emotional access is no longer constantly available, the mind naturally starts filling in the gaps. Not always accurately, but actively. It starts replaying interactions, revisiting words, and questioning shifts in behavior. Not because you forced it, but because the usual emotional pattern has been interrupted. Emotional detachment in this sense isn't about suppressing feelings. It's about separating your feelings from impulsive reaction. You still feel. You just don't immediately spill, chase, or over-explain every feeling into the dynamic. That creates stability. And stability changes how you are experienced. Because now you are no longer emotionally dependent on their responses. You are not adjusting your worth based on their availability. You are not trying to fix every moment of distance. You simply remain steady. And steadiness is what begins to shift perception. Not through intensity, but through consistency without neediness. At that point, you are no longer reacting to their avoidance patterns. You are no longer trying to manage their emotional distance. You are simply no longer over-investing in the same cycle. And that is where curiosity can naturally begin to appear. Not because you are manipulating anything, but because the dynamic they were used to is no longer functioning the same way. What used to be predictable is no longer predictable. What used to be emotionally accessible is no longer automatically available. And what used to be taken for granted now requires reflection. But the real shift is not about them. It's about you no longer abandoning yourself to stay emotionally visible in someone else's inconsistent world. You stop over-explaining. You stop over-giving. You stop over-performing emotional clarity for someone who isn't meeting you halfway. And in that space, your energy becomes quieter, more grounded, and more self-contained. Not distant in a wounded way, but complete in a centered way. And that kind of emotional positioning doesn't need to chase attention. It naturally changes how attention behaves around you. What they struggle with most isn't distance itself. It's not knowing. When someone who used to be emotionally open, expressive, and easy to read suddenly becomes quiet, the mind is forced into unfamiliar territory. There is no more clear signal to interpret, no emotional updates to track, no visible pattern to rely on. And that absence of information creates internal tension, because the mind naturally tries to complete what it cannot see. This is where the dynamic shifts, not through action, but through removal of constant access. When there is nothing left to analyze in real time, the other person's attention turns inward. They start filling the gaps with interpretation, memory, and imagination. And that is often more powerful than any direct communication. You don't need to exaggerate your presence or send indirect signals. In fact, when everything about you is constantly visible and emotionally readable, you become easier to categorize. And what is categorized is often mentally filed away instead of explored. But when you become less available to that constant emotional reading, something changes. You are no longer immediately understandable in the same way. There is less clarity, less instant emotional access, less predictability. And the mind does not stay indifferent to that for long. It starts asking quiet questions. Where did that energy go? Why does it feel different now? Why isn't there anything to interpret anymore? Not because you are actively doing something to provoke that response, but because the usual flow of emotional information has changed. It is important to understand that this is not about performing mystery or trying to appear different for effect. When mystery is intentional in a forced or performative way, it becomes obvious and loses its impact. Real impact comes from simply no longer overexposing your internal world. There is a difference between sharing and over-narrating yourself, between being present and constantly making yourself emotionally legible to someone who is not consistently meeting you halfway. When you stop over-narrating, you reclaim something important: your inner space. Not everything needs to be translated outward. Not every emotional shift needs to be explained. Not every reaction needs to be processed in front of someone who is inconsistent with your presence. And when that shift happens, the dynamic naturally changes. People who are used to emotional accessibility may initially experience that change as confusion. Not because you have disappeared, but because the familiar emotional reference points are no longer there. The mind tends to respond to that by trying to restore familiarity. It replays past interactions, searches for patterns, and attempts to understand what has changed. But what has really changed is not them. It is your level of availability. You are no longer constantly broadcasting your emotional state. You are no longer constantly providing updates, reactions, or explanations that make everything easy to read. And in the absence of that, attention becomes more internally active. However, the real center of this shift is not about controlling perception. It is about no longer abandoning yourself through overexposure. Because when you continuously explain, justify, and emotionally overshare to someone who is not consistently present, you begin to lose your own center in the process. Pulling back from that does not require performance. It requires steadiness. A quiet decision that your internal world does not need constant external validation to exist. That is where emotional presence becomes stronger than emotional noise. You are no longer reacting to every gap with explanation. You are no longer trying to fill silence with effort. You are simply no longer overextending your emotional energy to maintain access. And that creates a different kind of presence, one that is not dependent on visibility or constant interaction. At that point, the focus is no longer on being seen. It becomes about being grounded in yourself. And when someone experiences that shift, especially if they were used to a version of you that was more accessible, more reactive, or more emotionally available, they notice the difference in a subtle but real way. Not because you announced it, but because the pattern they were used to no longer exists in the same form. And that is what creates reflection. Not manipulation, not performance, not forced distance. Just a change in how much of yourself you are willing to continuously place outside of yourself for others to interpret. The moment you stop over-giving your emotional clarity to someone who does not consistently meet it with the same level of presence, you begin to return to yourself. You're not performing anymore, you're moving forward. And when that shift becomes real, it doesn't just change how you act, it changes how you are experienced. People don't just think about you in the same way. They start wondering about you. What changed? Where did that energy go? Who are you becoming now that you're no longer reacting the same way? Not because you are trying to be noticed, but because change that is not announced is felt differently. It creates space, and space naturally invites reflection. The point is not to prove that you've evolved. The point is to actually evolve and let that evolution speak for itself over time. Because what leaves a deeper impression is not explanation, it's transformation that doesn't ask for permission. When someone once felt they could easily read you, understand you, or predict your responses, and that pattern suddenly shifts, it creates a gap in their internal expectations. And that gap doesn't stay empty. It gets mentally explored. But real power is not in trying to control that reaction. It is in no longer living in a way that requires constant external validation to feel stable. There is something quietly powerful about a life that is no longer centered around being understood by the same people in the same way. Your direction changes, your focus changes, your emotional dependence on being seen in real time decreases. And that shift alone changes how others relate to you. Not because you are sending signals, but because you are no longer operating from the same emotional position. This is where boundaries start to become real, not as statements, but as behavior. A boundary that only exists in words can be argued with, questioned, or ignored. But a boundary that is consistently enforced through action doesn't need explanation. It simply becomes reality. You stop over-explaining what hurts you. You stop repeatedly justifying your limits. You stop trying to make someone understand something they are repeatedly not respecting. Instead, your response becomes simple and consistent. If something crosses your line, your behavior adjusts. If something drains you, your access changes. If something is not aligned, you step back. Not as punishment, not as performance, but as self-respect in action. And that is where the real shift happens. Because people can misunderstand your words, but they cannot easily ignore consistent behavior. Over time, patterns become the message, and what you allow, or no longer allow, becomes very clear without a single long explanation. For someone who is used to emotional flexibility from you, this change can feel unfamiliar. Not because you are doing something dramatic, but because the emotional availability they once relied on is no longer automatic. And when automatic access disappears, awareness increases. But the deeper purpose is not to trigger anyone. It is not to create confusion or emotional reaction. It is to stop abandoning your own internal limits just to maintain connection. That is the real shift from emotional over-explaining to emotional grounding. You stop turning your peace into something you have to negotiate. You stop making your emotional boundaries dependent on whether someone agrees with them. You stop turning your feelings into something that needs constant justification. Instead, you let your actions carry clarity. And in that clarity, something important happens. You begin to feel more aligned with yourself. Less scattered, less reactive, less pulled into cycles where you have to constantly explain your inner world to be respected in it. That is emotional maturity. Not silence as a strategy, but silence as stability. Not withdrawal as reaction, but withdrawal as choice. Not punishment, but alignment. And once you reach that point, you realize something important. Respect is not something you have to argue for. It is something your behavior defines. So you don't need to overstate your boundaries. You don't need to constantly reinforce your worth through explanation. You don't need to stay in emotional conversations that repeatedly ignore your limits. You simply live differently. And over time, that difference speaks louder than anything you could have said. In the end, this is not really about learning how to be mysterious, or how to disappear, or how to create some emotional reaction in someone who is avoidant. It was never truly about them in the first place. It was about what you kept sacrificing in yourself just to stay emotionally visible, just to stay understood, just to stay chosen in a space where you are not being met with the same level of presence. Because there comes a point where over-explaining stops being communication and starts becoming self-abandonment. Where constantly adjusting your tone, your words, your timing, your emotional expression stops being care and starts becoming erosion. You begin to lose pieces of your own clarity just to maintain connection with someone who is inconsistent with theirs. And that is where the real shift happens. Not in how they respond, but in how you stop participating in dynamics that require you to shrink, over-justify, or emotionally overextend just to be accepted. When you stop doing that, you don't become colder, you become clearer. You don't become distant, you become grounded. You don't lose emotional depth. You finally stop bleeding it into spaces that cannot hold it properly. And what you begin to realize is that peace was never found in being more understood by the wrong energy. Peace was found in no longer needing that understanding to validate your worth. In no longer waiting for emotional consistency from someone who only gives it in fragments. In no longer treating confusion as something you have to solve, instead of something you can simply step away from. At first, that space feels unfamiliar, because your nervous system is used to engagement, explanation, response, repair. It is used to trying to fix the distance through more effort. But slowly, something changes. You start noticing the difference between emotional investment and emotional depletion, between connection that grows you and connection that drains you, between being present and being pulled apart. And once you see that clearly, you cannot unsee it. You begin to understand that boundaries are not something you announce loudly. They are something you embody quietly. Not as a reaction, but as a standard. Not as punishment, but as protection. Not as a performance, but as a decision that your emotional world will no longer be available to people who handle it carelessly. You stop chasing clarity from people who thrive in ambiguity. You stop over-investing in dynamics that require you to over-explain your humanity. You stop mistaking emotional inconsistency for something you need to fix. And what remains is something much quieter, but far stronger. A sense of internal alignment. A sense of emotional self-trust. A sense that you can feel deeply without losing yourself in the process. That you can care without overgiving. That you can be present without abandoning your own center. That is the real conclusion of all of this. Not learning how to make someone crave you, not learning how to disappear in a strategic way, but learning how to no longer betray your own emotional truth just to stay inside someone else's limited capacity. Because once you stop abandoning yourself, you no longer need to chase anyone to feel whole. And from that place, everything you allow into your life, connection, love, attention, presence, stops being something you beg for and starts becoming something you choose with clarity. And that is where your real power has been all along.